Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Pune Ophthalmic Society, I welcome you all to this postgraduate education series of Pune Ophthalmic Society. Last week was very difficult for the entire Pune Ophthalmic Society as we lost a senior member, past Pune Ophthalmic Society President, Dr. Nandkumar Shah sir, fighting COVID. In his memory, we dedicate this postgraduation education of this particular week to him. Without any further delay, I invite Dr. Gitanjali Sharma, President Pune Ophthalmic Society, to take this meeting ahead. Gitanjali ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Mukesh. As Mukesh said, we are dedicating today's meeting in the memory of Dr. Nandakumar Shah sir, our past president, who had always encouraged us for all academic activities. Today we are having systemic evaluation of cornea for RPGs. And we are very fortunate to have a national faculty, Dr. Rishi Swarup, with us. Welcome, Dr. Rishi. You can start your video, please, Dr. Rishi. He is the medical director and chief surgeon of Swarup Eye Center, Hyderabad. He is alumni of Kasturba Medical College. He is a gold medalist. He has done his cornea fellowship from Shankar Nethralaya. He has done his FRCS ophthalm as well. He is honorary secretary of Hyderabad Ophthalmic Association. He is editor publication for Telangana Ophthalmic Society. He is section editor for cornea for Indian Journal of Ophthalmology. He has received many awards, American Academy Achievement Award, IIR SI Gold Medal. His special interests are in lamellar corneal surgery. There are a number of his presentations, national, international level, as well as his publications in peer-reviewed journals. So we welcome you, Dr. Rishi, and thank you for joining. And he will teach the PGs today. Our expert teachers today are Dr. Ranjana Pandey Madam and Dr. Shilpa Joshi Madam. I welcome both of you, Dr. Ranjana Madam and Dr. Shilpa Madam. Dr. Ranjana Madam is an associate professor of ophthalmology in BJ Government Medical College and Sassoon General Hospital. She has got the experience of teaching for more than 30 years. She has done her MS and DNB, and she is an examiner for MS and DNB as well. She looks after mainly the cornea section of the department and the eye bank. Shilpa Joshi Madam is a senior consultant and a medical director at HV Desai Eye Hospital. She has done her long-term fellowship in cornea from LV Prasad Eye Institute. She is in charge and HOD of the eye bank and the cornea. So I welcome both of you, and without taking much time, now over to you, Dr. Rishi, for cornea.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. At the outset, I'd like to thank the Pune Ophthalmological Society members for inviting me to be part of this wonderful webinar, and specifically my friend Sachin Kabra. He's one of the nicest people I know, and it's really nice to share this platform with him. This particular webinar is actually one of the best I'm attending because I'm getting to teach postgraduates, which is really close to my heart. The lockdown has given us an opportunity to really refresh our learning, and these webinars are a great platform for PGs. I wish we had them when I was doing my postgraduation. So you guys are very lucky, and I'm sure you're making the most of it. Without further ado, I'll just start sharing my presentation. The topic which Sachin wanted me to cover was systematic evaluation of the cornea, and I think this will be of use to postgraduates specifically, but I think it can be applicable to anybody who is seeing a lot of cornea patients in the clinic. So I hope you find it useful. I'm going to try and cover it in a systematic way. I will try and first cover the slit lamp examination of the cornea. So since this is for postgraduate, I'm keeping it a little basic initially, and then we'll also cover some specific things. Dry eye evaluation, corneal topography, corneal OCT, and then specular microscopy. And if we have time, I'll also touch upon confocal microscopy. I think this is the gold standard for any clinical evaluation. Actually, now almost all medical colleges have access to slit lamps, and it has become universal. I think this is 90% of your diagnosis can happen on a slit lamp. You don't really need diagnostics most of the time. Only for certain specific entities, diagnostics will really come in to your aid. So a good slit lamp examination, if you can do that, 90% of the time, you don't need anything else. Now, when we hit the cornea with light, three things can happen. Slit lamp is essentially delivering light, and then you're seeing back that reflected light via optics of the slit lamp. So the light can either get transmitted through the cornea, part of it will get reflected, and some amount of it will get absorbed by the corneal tissue. And based on these light cornea interactions, you will have different kind of appearances of the cornea, and different lesions can be visualized. And we play around with these light cornea interactions with different types of illumination for slit lamp evaluation. I'm sure all of you have read about these. So you have direct illumination and indirect illumination. Direct illumination can be diffuse, in which you basically have a white slit and you're seeing everything just like you would see with a torch, but much more magnified. You can have focal illumination, in which you kind of narrow the slit or make it a very fine slit. And a specific type of focal illumination is specular microscopy, in which we use a parallelepipette and use a specialized type of illumination to visualize the endothelium of the cornea. Indirect illumination is again three types: proximal illumination, retroillumination, and sclerotic scatter, and I'll be covering all of these briefly. Now, the most simple way is to start with diffuse illumination, and that's initially when you look at the cornea, always start with this. And before you directly hit the cornea, always first put the light on the sclera and then gently move into the cornea so that you don't dazzle the patient. Of course, start from out to in, look at the skin, eyelid first, then go into the conjunctiva and cornea, etc., and look at various regions. So this is very good to get a magnified view of anything which is there on the surface or which is visible to your eye, even on a torchlight, but you will get a more magnified and clearer view. So focal illumination is when you narrow the slit so that you can get a little more detail. So a good example of this is in these two pictures. Can one of the postgraduates here tell me what we are seeing here? Any of the postgraduates? Or should I move on?
So this is an anterior segment photograph. The
Yeah.
first image shows a diffuse illumination, and the pupil has been marked, probably the persistent pupillary membrane seen, and the second image shows an optical section focused on the iris.
Yeah, and what do you see there?
I think that is also a pupillary membrane, sir, although it's not very clear.
What do you see on the iris? Can you see the configuration of the iris?
Iris Bombay configuration, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
So this is an iris.
It is
Bombay.
iris, anterior bowing of the iris.
So in this case, this is just to show an example of if you don't use focal illumination, you will miss the Bombay. You will just see, okay, you'll probably make out that the anterior chamber is shallow, and you can see the membrane, but you won't pick up the iris Bombay configuration. That can only be picked up on a slit examination, which is a type of focal illumination. Focal illumination, you can make either a thin slit or you can make a wider slit, like an optical block of the cornea, like an optical section, and that is called a parallelepiped.
Pardon me, sir. Can we have a little higher voice? The voice is lesser. Pardon me for that.
I'm sorry. I'll just speak a little louder, and if it's not good, then I'll switch off my earphones. Just let me know. So this is another example. You can see a white dot on the cornea. Now this could be in the cornea or the lens, and the only way you can make it out is by making a slit. And slit tells you that the location of the opacity, even on the lens, it could be on the anterior capsule, as in this anterior polar cataract, or it could have been an anterior subcapsular opacity or a lenticular opacity. Even cornea, it could have been on the surface or the endothelium. So to make out the depth of any lesion on the cornea or the anterior segment, a focal illumination comes in use. Now this is the indirect type of illumination called indirect proximal illumination, in which basically what you're doing is on the slit lamp you have the option of decentering the illumination a little bit. So you're putting the light in one place and you're actually focusing at another place. So your area of interest is adjoining to the area where the light is hitting, And in this particular case, what are we seeing? Can one of the TDs tell us?
So we are seeing vesicular lesions on the cornea, possibly bulle.
This is the conjunctiva.
Okay.
What could this be? Near the limbus. This
The
is either
lymphoid
bite
aggregate
spot.
can.
Phytoid spots.
Yeah.
Yes. So you can see the internal structure of any opacity, specifically what's going on inside, and the outline as well, the size of the opacity, by doing this kind of an indirect proximal illumination. The other type of indirect illumination is retroillumination, in which light is hit an object to a surface or an object behind the object of interest, and the reflected light is used to see details of the object. So you can either use the iris, like is shown in this particular animation. The reflected light from the iris is then used to see the area of interest, or you could use the fundal glow. So when you're doing retroillumination, basically there are three optical phenomena coming in place. You have obstruction of light, scattering of light, and distortion of light. And all these help us to identify the object. Here you can see a superficial foreign body on the cornea. And by seeing it on retroillumination from the iris, you can see details. I apologize for the quality of this picture. This is some other images of corneal lesions. On the left, both are using fundal glow. And can one of the PGs quickly tell what lesions we're looking at? So the left picture is crack kind of a map-like lesion. This is a posterior polymorphic dystrophy of the endothelium, and the right has a post-arcade, and you can see the arcade cuts in the retroillumination. The third type of indirect illumination is the broad tangential illumination, which is mainly used in corneal photography, where you don't want the light of the filament coming into the image. So you put it at 90 degrees, the illumination, and so that the filament doesn't come into the image. And it's especially useful in highlighting abnormalities in the anterior and posterior surfaces of the cornea. A specific type of focal illumination is the specular reflection. This is a direct focal illumination in which we make a parallelepiped. Now, basically, we are using the optical quality of the cornea to work as a convex mirror in this. So only 0.02% of the incident light on the endothelium is actually reflected back, and everything else is either passed through or absorbed. And this requires a particular exact alignment of the slit lamp optics and the illumination to be able to see the endothelium. So you use the highest magnification, and you create an angle of about 60 degrees between the illuminating beam and the observing microscope. And the patient's axis should actually bisect these two. So either you can take the illumination and the observation scopes on both sides and ask the patient to look straight, or you can keep your observation scope straight and take the illumination 90 degrees and ask the patient to look midway. This is always seen as a monocular phenomenon. You don't see it binocularly. You focus on the corneal endothelium, make the slit into a slightly wider slit, you get a parallelepiped, which is a optical block of the cornea, and you keep the intensity of the light maximum and make the height of your beam minimum, like this. So what you do is you keep moving the slit lamp till the filament reflects. You can see the left bottom arrow is aligned with the anterior corneal surface on the parallelepiped. And as soon as that happens, the endothelial reflex will dazzle up. One more thing which I forgot to tell you is you have to also decenter your illumination, observation scope a little bit, so that the point of illumination and point of observation are slightly different. And then you focus on the endothelium, and you can immediately start seeing the hexagonal pattern of the endothelium, which is very, very typical. Of course, the magnification should be the maximum, and if your slit lamp allows, you should try and get like 40x type of magnification, then you can even see more details. So that's how you put the filament reflex on the anterior surface, and the endothelium will dazzle up. And in the central part is where you will, just behind the filament reflex is where you will see the endothelial pattern. Another type of specific type of indirect focal illumination is sclerotic scatter. In this, basically, you put light at the limbus, and again, you have to decenter the observation scope. And basically, your light at the limbus lights up the whole cornea with total internal reflection. And any opacity which breaks this transmission of light within the cornea will light up. And you can see the borders of the opacity quite well. So if you have like corneal deposits or some dystrophies, specifically, this comes in very useful even for the corneal opacity. So the opacities will scatter the light, and that's why they'll get highlighted in the sclerotic scatter. One of the ways to be sure that you're doing a sclerotic scatter is the whole limbus lights up like a ring, as you can see in this image. So that's about slit lamp examination. Before we get into diagnostics, would the panelists want to say some things or ask you some questions?
Hello, can I ask?
Yes, of course.
Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead. Ma'am, till the time you go ahead, I can request Rishi sir to try without the earphone, sir, if you don't mind, sir.
Sure, I'll do that.
Yeah,
What
ma'am, go ahead, please.
are the to the residents? I want to ask, what are the basic parameters of slit lamp you should be using? What are the basic 4 parameters of slit lamps you should consider while focusing all these types of illumination, all the types of views, like direct illumination, and what are the various parameters of beam? What are those 4 parameters? Do you understand my question?
Ma'am, the width of the beam, height of the beam,
Correct.
intensity
Width
of
the
light,
beam. Yes.
height of the
Then
beam, the intensity of light that we are using,
yes.
And the angle of
Most important,
The filter, if anybody.
and the position of the illuminating and the observing.
What else?
the angle of incidence.
Angle.
Width, angulation. Yes, agreed. Angulation, beam width, illumination, and what is 4th one?
Height of the beam.
Oh, ma'am.
No, that will come with the beam itself.
Okay.
Ma'am, a filter if it is used.
Filter is an additional thing. But what is with the beam itself? What is with those 2 machines? Well, most important is magnification.
Magnification.
Yes, ma'am.
Agreed. Magnification,
Yes, ma'am.
illumination, beam width, and angulation of the beam. These are the 4 things you have to remember while focusing from one type of illumination to the end of the illumination. According to that, you have to say, make your beam and illumination setup. Now you tell me something about filters. Ananya?
Yes, ma'am. So,
Huh.
ma'am, in the observation system only, in the illumination system only, after the light, there is a filter block, which is going to have a neutral density filter, a cobalt blue filter, a red free filter.
Yes.
And it will help us examine the cornea, especially when using special stains.
Yes, correct. Padma, you tell me, how will you measure any corneal lesion? How will you measure any corneal lesion on slit lamp?
Ma'am, firstly, what we have to do is focus on the lesion and make sure that the intensity is not too bright for the patient. And then what we have to do is first orient the beam along the long axis of the lesion that is there. On the top,
Let me know how you will align it. How will you align it?
There's the
At
housing
the long
system of the slit lamp, which you can rotate, ma'am. So that helps
Yes,
you.
correct. You will rotate that beam so it will come on the long axis.
On the long axis.
After
and then
that,
you have to adjust the beam, the height of the beam with the knob that is present. And usually the measurements are given right below that housing box. So we measure along one axis, then tilt it by 90 degrees, or if we want any oblique measurements, tilt it less than 90 degrees to whatever angle you want, and then take the readings from the scale that is given on the machine itself.
Okay. Now, do you know, Richa, tell me, what are the types of optical sections of the cornea? What are the various optical sections of the cornea? Do you know them? Any of you, anybody of you?
Optical sections.
Huh?
Optical sections we can produce by focusing a very narrow slit beam obliquely. So we get the optical section of the cornea as well as the lens. So anterior most, we get a bright tear film layer. Then we get a
But how you,
epithelial layer.
there are three varieties. There are three varieties of beads, optical cross sections. Do you know, you do it, man. You people do regularly. You people do it regularly.
Yes, Ananya, you were saying something. Please.
Ma'am, it could be a slit section, it could be a parallelepiped, or it could be diffuse illumination.
A conical
No,
section.
diffuse illumination is a different, altogether different. What I am asking you is the optical section. Optical section means you are saying it's a cut section of the cornea you see actually, or cut section of the eyeball you see. It is called as optical section. Diffuse illumination is altogether different. Optical section, there are three types. One is conical beam, which you see for flare. Which you see for flare. Aqueous flare or aqueous cells, what you see is the conical beam, which is a rectangular, is the smallest square beam. Understand? You do it, no? You reduce the height and reduce the width and make the smallest beam. That is called as a conical beam. Then you take another beam, where you take the another beam like that, where you see the optical cross section. It is a
parallelepiped.
Yes, and von Herrick's technique also you see the optical section only, na. You count the thickness of cornea, you see the anterior chamber, and then you see the iris. Yes, these are the cross-sectional beams. And there is a one classic corneal cross-section beam. How you produce that beam, you tell me. How you produce that beam on the machine? What are the settings of the beam?
Ma'am, the slit should be narrow. It should be
Yes.
0.1 to 0.25 millimeter wide and 7
Yes.
to 9 millimeter height. And the magnification can be kept up to 10 times, 7 to 10 times.
No, it needs a very high magnification. It is the optical section. What is the another name of slit lamp examination? Ananya?
Slit lamp biomicroscopy.
Correct. It is a biomicroscopy. So you have to have a magnified section of the cornea. So you put the magnification of 15 times to 20 times. It is the higher magnification you go, and then you can get a optical sections. So these are the basic things you should do in slit lamp examination. Rest of the things you know, but if okay, fine.
Yeah, ma'am, we'll just we'll come back to the questions at the end also.
Yes,
If you
start.
don't mind, yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Rishi, please continue.
Is the volume better now?
Yes.
It's very good, yeah.
Yeah.
I just adjusted the settings.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thus, in between sessions, only 2 minutes question answers, so that we can cover the most of the topics that Dr. Rishi wants to finish, please. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So the next, after we have seen the patient on a slit lamp, if you need to do, depending on what your clinical diagnosis, you want to do some special tests. And I'm just going to go from the front of the cornea to the back. So we'll start with the ocular surface. Dry eye diagnostics are probably the most common thing that you do in your clinic. And we recently got the DUSE 2 guidelines, and I'll just try and use that flow to tell you what to do. So whenever you're faced with a dry eye question, you want to start with triaging questions, look for risk factors, specifically like contact lenses, smoking, etc. And then when you suspect a dry eye, you want to do the diagnostic test. So the diagnostic tests are firstly screening with respect to specific questionnaires. And after that, you also do some tests for specific homeostasis markers, which include tear film breakup time, tear film osmolarity if you have access to that, and ocular surface staining, the vital staining. Okay. And then depending on what type of dry eye that you are looking at, you want to classify whether it's an aqueous deficiency or evaporative. You have to do some specific tests to differentiate these two. So the question is, we have two main validated questionnaires that are popular worldwide. One is the Dry Eye Questionnaire 5, which is on the left side, and on the right you have the Ocular Surface Disease Index Questionnaire. So both are validated, and on the DEQ5, your score should be 6 or above, and on the OSDI 13 or above to have a suspicion of dry eye. So there are, of course, there are others. These are self-administered questionnaires, and a positive result suggests that a patient might have a dry eye diagnosis, and one should then trigger the diagnostic test for confirmation. Diagnostic tests, I think the simplest test that one can do in the clinic is a tear film breakup time. You don't need anything extra except fluorescein, which every slit lamp will have access to. And basically what you're trying to do is you're going to instill fluorescein into the tear film and ask the patient to blink a few times, and then ask him to keep the eye open without blinking. And you're looking for a random dry spot, which means that the first place where the tear film breaks up, and on repeated observations, it should not be the same spot, and every time it should be a different spot. So if you're getting a random spot, the time which it takes from the time you stop blinking till that random dry spot appears is called the tear film breakup time. Ideally, this should be done before any other drops have been instilled in the eye, like including Paracaine, otherwise that can affect the result. So this is just a video showing the same thing. This is what a dry spot looks like. On fluorescein, it appears black. So after a blink, it's kind of a black spot. And repeated blinks, the spot should be at a different location, indicating that if it's not at a random spot and coming again and again, then that means there's some kind of a focal irregularity in that area, like a Dellen, or maybe you have a pinguicula that's causing a focal drying in the cornea, and that kind of a dry spot should not be counted for TBUT. That's very, very important. A TBUT basically tells you about the tear film stability. So a low TBUT indicates that either there's a deficiency in your mucin layer or your lipid layer, and it could be a marker for evaporative dry eye. TBUT can be perfectly normal if you have an abnormal TBUT does not necessarily indicate tear film evaporative dry eye. It could also be abnormal in aqueous deficient dry eye. But if the Schirmer's is normal, but the TBUT is altered, then that could be an indication that you're dealing with an evaporative dry eye. The second test, which is suggested by the used to classification tear film osmolarity, actually forever this has been one of the classic diagnostic modalities. The cutoff value for normal is less than 300 milliosmoles per liter. So if it is more than that, that means that there's not enough water in your tears, and that's why you're having dry eye disease. It's probably the most important marker for dry eye disease, but the limitation is we don't have the ability to test it in the clinic very accurately. Until recently, we didn't even have a commercial machine available, and this was essentially a lab tool in research settings. Now we do have an equipment like this called the Tear Lab. So you could use these cutoff values, but actually, rather than the cutoff value itself, it is said that the interocular difference being more than 8 milliosmoles per liter is more suggestive rather than the actual value itself, because the value can be confounded by various things, such as when the person is last blinked, and if their posture can affect the tear film osmolarity measured by this. So there can be some measurement errors just going with the osmolarity cutoff value, and the interocular difference may actually be a better measure of dry eye disease with this particular instance. The third important diagnostic tool is the ocular surface staining, and the most important stain, of course, is sodium fluorescein, and that will really tell us where your epithelium is having punctate epithelial erosion. But you could also use vital stains like lissamine green or rose bengal. Rose bengal and lissamine green will essentially stain the same thing with any kind of devitalized tissue. But the advantage of lissamine green is that it is less toxic and irritating to the ocular surface. You don't really need to use a lot of proparacaine or anesthetic to kind of numb the discomfort. So they have various grading methodologies, but essentially, if you have more than 9 conjunctival spots and more than 5 corneal punctate spots, then this could be an indication of dry eye disease. And if you're seeing any such thing, you should be suspicious of dry eye. And not just the number of spots, but also the location of your staining becomes very important. So if you have like an inferior kind of a staining, that could be more suggestive of a lid margin disease related thing, because that's where your lid margin will fall when your eyes are closed. If you have more of a central kind of a pathology, that could be an indication of aqueous deficiency dry eye, like keratoconjunctivitis pitta. And suppose you have more of a superior staining, then it could indicate some other thing like a superior limbic keratoconjunctivitis, etc. And if diffuse staining involving the entire cornea could be indicative of a condition called keratitis medicamentoosa or some sort of a toxic. So if you're looking at, these are the homeostasis tests, but in addition to that, you have specific tests to try and differentiate aqueous deficiency from evaporative dry eye. The most important one for aqueous deficiency dry eye is the Schirmer's test, which we all have in our clinic. The other simple test is to try and measure the slit lamp, the tear film meniscus. You could either just use a slit lamp to measure it, or you can use specific instruments. Now we have a lot of dry eye diagnostic equipment which can measure the TMS meniscus and the volume very accurately. You can even use an OCT to do this, and this is called a meniscometry. For evaporative dry eye, you want to really assess the meibomian glands, because that's where the pathology is. So you want to see the morphology using, you can of course assess it on the slit lamp by pressing the meibomian glands, etc., and seeing the what kind of fluid that is expressed. Other than that, you want to look at the meibography to see the morphology of the meibomian glands and the extent of damage. And you can measure the lipid layer thickness using interferometry. You can also do a blink analysis, which is specifically useful in some particular type of evaporative dry eyes, and look for lid viper epicular fatigue by inverting the task. So meniscometry, basically you're trying to measure the tear film height. Slit lamp is probably the easiest way. You have now specific diagnostic equipment which can do that. We have the SDM machine, and you have a LipiView which can analyze the tear film height. In addition to that, you can use an OCT, and that is called OCT meniscometry. You basically orient the slit vertically, and then you can use the graticule on the OCT to measure the meniscus height, as well as you can use calculate the height and diameter to calculate the meniscus volume, as is shown in the image here. The second important test, of course, is the Schirmer's test, which we all are familiar with. We use a specific type of paper strip in the lateral, calibrated Schirmer's paper strip, which is basically a filter paper, Portman filter paper of 5:1, and it's applied on the lateral 1/3 of the lid margin. And at that time, after you've inserted it, you want to have the patient blink normally, neither keep the eye too open or just closed, and you want to keep the room lighting, and you want to kind of switch off the fan so that there are no other factors which can cause tearing. There are 3 types. The Schirmer's 1 is without anesthesia, Schirmer's 1A is with anesthesia, and then you have other modifications in which you're trying to stimulate reflex tearing, but practically they are not of much use. So in my clinic, I essentially use the Schirmer's 1A, and my cutoff value is 5 millimeters, 5 minutes, 5 millimeters. Anything less than 5 millimeters is almost diagnostic of an aqueous deficiency. Between 5 to 10, you can be suspicious, and more than 10, then you can be sure that the aqueous component of the tear film is quite at risk. So essentially, the Schirmer's is helping you measure the aqueous component of the tear film. So of course, this is what it looks like, and I'm sure all of you have seen it. If you're using it just after tear film breakup time, you can actually get fluorescein greenish discoloration, which also helps to mark the paper very well. After you've done the test, it's a good idea to put a pen mark to the margin of still where it has stained, if you don't have a measurement on your paper already. because sometimes after the tear, you can stick this to the file for further reference. For specific diagnostics for evaporative dry eye, meibomian gland assessment on the slit lamp is very important. So you want to see whether the meibum is clear and comes out with gentle pressure. If it is very cloudy and opaque or toothpaste-like, that is diagnostic of MGD, and then you'll have to do specific treatment for that. You also have to look at the top of the meibomian orifices. They could be capped or they could be obliterated, and that will also tell you what's going on to the gland beneath it. But really the best way to look at the meibomian gland is the meibography, in which you invert the tarsal conjunctiva and try to visualize the meibomian gland using infrared light. So you take infrared photographs in high magnification. Now we have specific machines which can do that. But if you don't have this, you can also just use any infrared camera. Even the your autoref has an infrared camera. You can put the patient on autoref and evaluate the meibomian glands using meibography. So this gives you a good quantitative evaluation of the meibomian glands. And you can see in the above image, there are areas of dropout where there is no meibomian gland at all. And this indicates that the meibomian gland disease is gone so far that the gland is actually atrophied and died. After this stage, any kind of hot fermentation or massage is not going to help. So you want to catch them at the stage when the disease is still active and your meibomian glands are completely thickened and tortuous. That indicates a blockage. So these are my meibomian glands. You can see that my meibomian glands are fairly okay, but there's still a little bit of tortuosity and thickening, especially in the left side. You can see the profile of the lower lid meibomian glands is a little thicker and short compared to the upper ones, which are longer and thin. Essentially, you want to see straight parallel lines. If you see a lot of tortuosity and a lot of thickening, that indicates blockage. And if you have areas of blackout, which dropout, which indicates that the gland has already died. One thing you have to keep in mind is that if you have a lot of tarsal conjunctival scarring, sometimes that may give you a false impression of dropout, but it's actually because the light is not really being captured very well through that scarring, and you're not able to image the meibomian gland so well. So take meibography with a pinch of salt. Always look at the health of the tarsal conjunctiva. The other thing that this machine also does is it gives you a blink analysis and an interferometry. So you can see this lipid moving up, and so this is a LipiFlow, LipiView, which measures your lipid layer thickness by using this pattern of this color, which you can see on the clear film. It measures the lipid layer thickness. Also, it does it because it has a high-speed camera and high magnification. Also, does a analysis of the blink, whether the blinks are complete or not. So that's also called a dynamic blink analysis. So this machine is quite useful, and this is what the report looks like. So you can see that it gives you the average lipid layer thickness, which in my case is 53 nanometers in the right eye and 74 in the left eye, which is within the normal range. And you can see that after the blink, the lipid layer kind of becomes thinner, and then again after every blink it becomes thick, and then as the eyes open it becomes thinner. You can see on that graph. And you can also see that there are partial blinks. So in my right eye I have quite a few partial blinks, 5 out of 6. Similarly in the left eye. So partial blinks can be a previously unknown cause of dry eye. So if you see some patients who have a lot of symptoms and otherwise their parameters are all normal, maybe they just have a few SPKs which are unexplained, this could be the reason that the eye is not closing completely. And such patients, you can treat them accordingly, then understanding that their eye is not closing completely when they blink, and that's why their tear film is probably drying up. So that's about dry eye diagnostics. I'll stop for a bit, and maybe we can have a couple of questions before I move on.
Okay, so the question is, apart from this a tear film breakup test that we normally do, what are the other methods of doing this test? This is for the residents, the PGs. The other methods of doing the TBUT.
Ma'am and PGs can make their video on.
One of our panelist PGs can answer. Ananya. repeat the question. What are the other methods of doing a TBUT apart from the fluorescent TBUT that we?
Ma'am, a videographic method is also done without the stain, which is a non-invasive method to see the first dry spot.
Ananya, sorry, you are not clear.
Ma'am, a videographic method is also available where a camera captures the corneal surface and notes the first dry spot without the stain.
Yeah, so there are certain non-invasive methods, NIBUT,
NIBUT.
that are available in the these machines, the dry eye analyzers, in which uh, you look for the appearance of hot spot or red spot after first blink and second blink. Then the patient is asked to stop blinking till you get the dry spot, which is in the form of detected in the form of a hot spot on that machine, red spot. So that is the NIBUT. Apart from that, there is a instrument called as a xeroscope, which has certain grids, which can also be focused onto the cornea, and distortion of the grid or distortion of the those Myers. It can also be used as a method. These are the NIBUT or the non-invasive methods of doing a tear film breakup.
Yes.
What other methods are important? What are the other tests you should do in these patients? Hello?
Hello? Yes, ma'am.
What are the other tests you will like to do in this patient other than tear osmolality related to tears? But there are some other tests also other than tear tests or other than meibomian gland test, because the tear contains 3 layers, no, aqueous, meibomian, lipid, aqueous, and
Mucin.
mucin. So what are
Mucin.
other tests you will like to do also? So what they are? Mucin layer is related to what?
Goblet cells, ma'am.
So what you are going to test? Which are the tests you will like to do? Padma? Some dyes you will like to add to your test?
Lissamine green is used for
Lissamine.
conjunctiva.
Yes, Lissamine green or Rose Bengal. You will check the conjunctiva also, whether there is any staining of the conjunctiva. So in ocular surface disorders, along with tear film, you have to check for the conjunctiva also.
Ma'am, and the lacrimal system should also be assessed.
Lacrimal, no, not much, because it
That
is
can be
related to,
done through Schirmer's test.
yeah.
So evaluation of the tear production can be done.
So normally when we are saying that we are doing a dry eye assessment, generally what are the 5 or 6 tests that we should be looking at or we should be doing? Can anybody just quickly enumerate them?
First,
Ma'am,
when we observe the patient on the slit lamp, first we look for the tear meniscus height, which we can see
Right.
readily. After that,
Yes.
we can look for the general appearance of the to check if there's any appearance of dryness through the slit lamp, which we see. Then we can do the tear film breakup time. We do the
Yeah. So
Schirmer's
that's the
test,
second one, tear film breakup. Yes.
and then you do the
Third,
Schirmer's test.
Fourth,
Schirmer's is usually not counted as a part of this because the results can be variable. Yes, it is an important thing in the dry eye assessment, but you know, that would come in the I mean last in the list of the tests that we are generally doing. What are the other things?
There's also a dye disappearance test that is done.
Normally, in a normal slit lamp examination, what are the things?
Meibomian gland examinations.
Yeah, meibomian gland assessment, very important. Like how many of those glands are blocked? How many
Expressibility, yes, ma'am. The type of
expressibility?
secretion, expressibility,
Yes, yes.
whether it is
And
clear, cloudy, or it has debris.
right. So that is the third test. What
Yes,
else?
ma'am.
Ma'am, any corneal signs of dry eye like mucin or filaments over the cornea?
How will you detect those?
With rose Bengal staining, it would be helpful.
Yeah. So ocular surface staining is the fourth one. So normally, which are the dyes that you use for ocular surface staining?
Ma'am, fluorescein sodium
Fluorescein.
2%,
Lysamine
green,
green
and rose Bengal.
and rose Bengal.
Yeah, fluorescein, rose Bengal, and lysamine green.
Lysamine
These are,
green.
yeah, these are the commonly used ones. So that's the fourth one. What else? Any other thing? And of course, grading of this uh, ocular surface staining. There are various again methods of grading of or the ocular surface grading schemes.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell one of those?
Ma'am, there's a National Eye Institute grading and Oxford grading.
Yeah, so the Oxford schema is generally commonly used, in which you take into account the palpable surface of the conjunctiva and cornea for the grading, and a score of 0 to 9 is given for to assess the severity.
Yes, ma'am.
What else? The fifth one is the meibomian gland meibography using the infrared filter, which Dr. Rushi was telling us just now. Again, very important test to assess for the loss of meibomian glands and to detect the capture the changes in the early stage. Other one is the lipid layer evaluation, which is also part of this dry eye analyzer. And the last
Yes.
one is the conjunctival hyperemia or conjunctival congestion. So that is also assessed. So these are normally the 5 or 6 tests or parameters which you look at. And Shermer's, of course, Shermer's, I will put it in the end. These are the things which are used for the assessment of the dry eye.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. I think we'll move on to the next part now.
Yeah, sure.
Dr. Rishi, you can start.
Please unmute yourself, Dr. Rishi. Dr. Rishi, please unmute yourself.
Sorry. Okay, so topography means the arrangement of the natural and artificial physical features of an area, like topography of an island, or as in this case, this is the topography of the moon. As you can see, it looks very similar to our topography of the cornea, except that this is in kilometers. So typically, when you're using one of the modern topographers, you'll get a quad map like this. So you have the top left, you can see this is the anterior float or the anterior elevation map. You have the posterior float or the posterior elevation map there. And bottom left, you have the curvature map, which is the normal curvature map which you get in the older topographers. And then you have a pachymetry map, which gives us the thickness of the map of the cornea at different points. In the center, you have these kind of data, which is a lot of statistics and data about the cornea. It is also very useful. So the traditional topographer is a Placido ring system in which we are kind of projecting the system of Placido rings on the alternating black and white rings on the cornea, and the reflected image is then analyzed to kind of get an image. And this is what the computer kind of picks up, the raw image, and then it is analyzed to kind of give us a color map to give us the shape of the cornea at different points. Now, when you're looking at the raw image of any topography, we should look at how wide the raw image is. So how much of the cornea has been captured, whether it's properly centered or not, because sometimes you might think of a decentration on the map, but actually the image will be decentered. So an asymmetric cornea can look asymmetric if it's decentered on the cornea, on the topographer. And look for artifactual data loss. For example, if you have a dry spot, if your ask the patient to keep his eyes open and then capture the image a little late. A dry spot will show as an irregularity on your topographer, and you'll think that this patient has some keratoconus or some disease, but actually it's just a dry spot. And if you put a lubricant drop and try again, it will be clear. So whenever you have a doubtful cornea on the topographer, please go back to the machine and look at the raw image and look for any such irregularities which might tell you that there's a problem. When you look at a map, you want to be able to interpret it in a systematic way. So you want to look at three main things. You want to look at the scale of the map, whether it's an absolute scale or a normalized scale or a customized scale. Second thing is, what type of map are we looking at? Is it what type of curvature map? Is it an axial map or a tangential map? And third is the topographic pattern. So that's the interpretation of your topographic map. So when you look at these maps, you have four maps here. The top left shows you like a round kind of a map. And the second one shows you some, that looks pretty normal, right? The second one looks like there's some little bit of an abnormality. And if you look at the bottom two, the left one looks pretty normal, like symmetric bow tie, but the right one looks a little dangerous. But actually the left and right are actually the same map. The only difference in these two maps are the scale. So you can see at the bottom right, there's a color scale. And the left one has many colors in it and lots of these horizontal bars. So this is a standard scale. So every machine has a standard lowest keratometric value and highest keratometric value. So you can see in this particular one, it's 9 for 2, 101 diopters. So in this scale, the normal will appear yellow to orange. Whereas in the same eye on the right side, you have defined the upper limit and lower limit, which is basically the lowest power and the highest power of this particular cornea is what is selected in a normalized scale. And in that case, it looks very different, the map. Similarly, the bottom one starts showing you these red kind of colors which you associated with ectasia. But actually, if you see the values, they're very normal. 44 and 43 are the flat and steep keratometric values. So scale can make all the difference. So whenever you look at a map, try to look at it in a standard scale so that one map is comparable to the other, one patient's map is comparable to the other patient's map, and you get used to the color map of your particular topography. Please avoid normalized scales in most situations, except if you have some doubt. In such special situations, you can go try to see the normalized scale if you're able to see something more. So normalized scale helps to enhance small abnormalities if you want to pick up those in the early stage. The second thing is the type of curvature map. So routinely we are, in most cases, in most topographers, we are used to seeing axial map, which is like an end-on view of the curvature of the cornea. But then there's something also known as the instantaneous map, in which it is a point-to-point measurement of the power is done. So it's basically a different way of measuring the power. The practical way of understanding is the axial map will be more like a centralized view, and instantaneous map will give you a little more wider view of the topography. So you will get more information of the periphery of the cornea in instantaneous map. So especially in situations where you're expecting a peripheral problem like a pellucid marginal degeneration, or if a patient is post-LASIK and you want to see the edge of the flap, or if you have something which is more likely to be peripheral. In such cases, an instantaneous map comes in more handy compared to an axial map. Axial map may pick up lesions better, central lesions better, but if you want to have a more of a bird's eye view of the topography, an instantaneous map is always better. So in my clinic, I try to take the instantaneous map in most cases. Now these are the next coming to the pattern of the curvature map. So these are the normal patterns. One is just like a uniform color throughout, or you get an oval or a round pattern, or a symmetric bow tie like these. All these are normal patterns because they are symmetric. And this doesn't indicate any pathology. These are suspicious patterns. So like a small island of steeping inferiorly you have, or you have a asymmetric kind of a bow tie, like a lazy A. So these are suspicious, but the colors are not very hot. So you know, the scale has, the upper colors are called the hot colors and the lower colors are the cool colors. The cool colors indicate flatter corneas. Red or red and upper colors indicate steeper corneas. So when you start seeing a lot of hot colors, you need to be a little alert. Orange is like a normal color, so the color is pretty normal, but you have a little asymmetry in the pattern, and this could often be from epithelial irregularities on the cornea. So if you have a patient who's been using contact lenses, they develop something called a contact lens warpage. The contact lens wear causes focal thickenings in the cornea, which may not be symmetric, and that can cause a appearance of asymmetry. But if you give some time for the eye to be contact lens free, these often become normal. These are frankly abnormal topography. So you can see a lot of hot colors, and you can see like an asymmetric bow tie on the top left. You can see an asymmetric bow tie with skewing of the axis. So the two axes are not in line. The first one, they are in line but asymmetric. The second one, they are skewed. And if you see a lot of skewing, that indicates an abnormality. Or if you just see a focal large hot spot like this, that again indicates an abnormality. Or abnormal against the rule kind of bow tie with a inferior island of flattening. This is very typical of a peripheral ectasia called pellucid marginal region. Okay, so these are all those, what I showed you earlier were abnormal maps on a curvature topography. So in a quad map, the bottom left one is a curvature map. In a Placido map, that's the only map which really comes. But in a quad map, that's one of the 4 maps. In addition to the curvature map, you also get the elevation data, which is the anterior and posterior elevation maps, and the thickness map. So these are in modern topographers which have either a slit scanning technology or a Scheimpflug kind of a technology, which tells us both about the anterior and posterior surfaces of the cornea. So I told you about these 4 maps and the statistics of the data. So in an elevation map, you're not really seeing the curvature, but you're seeing how each point on the cornea, either on the anterior surface or on the posterior surface, differs in height with respect to a best fit sphere. So this yellow is the best fit sphere, which is basically the average curvature of the cornea. So based on that average curvature, it gives you a sphere, and how each point on the cornea corresponds to that best fit sphere is depicted on a color map. So you can see the corresponding map on the right side. On the center, you have hot colors indicating that they are elevated compared to the best fit sphere. And then you have a ring of flattening, which is blue. And then again, you have a like a warmer color peripheral to that. So this is a patient with an ectasia, which shows you a focal hotspot like that. Similarly, in the quad map of a classic case, you can see. So here you see that the curvature map in the bottom left is actually showing a very normal oval kind of a pattern. But if you were to see the elevation map, the anterior elevation map shows a little bit of a focal hotspot, and the posterior map shows a significantly elevated hotspot with a lot of red kind of a color, which means that it is significantly elevated. So this is a typical case of an early keratoconus, and you can see correspondingly in that area, the cornea is also thinned out. You can see the central pachymetry is about 430 microns. So this is a case of a former thrust keratoconus or an early keratoconus, which would have been missed if you had just done a Placido topographer, but has been picked up because you have done a elevation slit-based topography. This, of course, is a classic ectasia, more advanced ectasia. All the things are abnormal. Even the curvature map shows a lot of hot colors with very steep values of the keratometry, and elevation maps are high, and the pachymetry shows a very low corneal thickness. This again shows a peripheral kind of an inferior ectasia on the curvature map, and you can see that the elevation maps show inferior steepening, and correspondingly on the pachymetry map, the inferior cornea is thinner compared to the superior cornea. This is a patient of pellucid marginal region. In addition to these maps, you have a lot of numbers also which a topographer gives you. The most common one is the SIM-K values, which is a simulated K. So basically, a topographer is giving you keratometric values very similar to what you would get with a keratometer, which is a 3 millimeter ring from the center of the cornea. What are the K values? And steepest and the flattest. So it gives you a steep K and a flat K. In addition to that, there are several other indices which are available in different machines: surface asymmetry index, surface regularity index, and they have specialized keratoconus indices like Gabinovitch and cone location magnitude index, first stage probability of keratoconus, etc., etc. There are lots of tachymetric indices that are available. I won't go into these because they depend upon the machine which you're using, and there are loads of them, so you can read these up. One of the common popular machines is the Pentacam, which has a specialized kind of a display to analyze for ectasia called the BAD display, or the Bellin-Ambrosio Enhanced Ectasia Display. And this there's a combination of a lot of elevation and tachymetric data and makes an intelligent all-inclusive display with high sensitivity and specificity to detect subclinical keratoconus. And instead of a normal best sphere, which normal topographer uses, this uses a specialized thing called an enhanced best sphere, so that it picks up these lesions earlier. So how it does this is this enhanced best sphere. It excludes the 4 millimeters of the thinnest cornea, 1 4 millimeter zone. So the steep area is actually excluded in your best fit sphere. So your best fit sphere overall becomes flatter, and because of that, the curved areas become more enhanced, as is shown in this particular cartoon. So the left would be with a normal map, and with the enhanced best fit sphere, the same elevated area will show more hot colors because the elevation will be more pronounced. So that's what it looks like. And in addition to that, the BAD display also has these specialized tachymetric progression index maps. So how the tachymetry changes from the center to the periphery, that also gives you an idea. And if it doesn't fall between these two lines on either side of the normal, it would indicate, or it doesn't follow the pattern, there's a sudden curvature change, that would indicate an abnormality. So you can see on the BAD display on the left side and the right side, you can see that red hot central area, which is the difference between the baseline elevation map and the enhanced elevation map. And if the difference is significant, like it's shown in the bottom right, it indicates a ectasia. Dr. Bradley Randleman has come out with a ectasia risk scoring system to identify if patients have risk of developing ectasia after LASIK. So whenever you're doing LASIK, you can try and score your patients to see if there's risk of ectasia. And this is one of the validated scoring systems for identifying the risk of ectasia. Should I move on in the interest of time, and we do questions in the end?
Dr. Rishi will take a 1 minute break. A quick question.
Okay, sure.
Ma'am, you can ask any.
What is the appearance of topography in cases of pellucid marginal degeneration? What it is called as?
Butterfly
Dot
kind of
appearance or crab claw appearance.
crab claw.
Inferior arcuate steepening.
No, it is a
Kissing dot
somebody
appearance.
told na crab claw appearance.
Crab claw appearance.
Yes, ma'am.
That is seen in pellucid marginal degeneration. In keratoconus, it is called as bow tie, asymmetric bow tie. These are few questions you are generally asked in examination.
Yes, ma'am.
Almost all the recent exam going students in the past 3 or 4 years have definitely been asked topography. So just for the PGs to understand that, it is very important that you brush up the topography at least before you go for exams. It has been asked to almost all the students. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yes, you are true.
Yeah. Over to you, Dr. Rishi.
Thank you. My slides are visible again?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just go on to the next important diagnostic methodology, which has become more important in the recent past, is the OCT, or the optical coherence tomography. Originally, probably it was not made so much for the anterior segment, but now in my practice, this has become an invaluable instrument. So this is what an OCT is inside. If you open up and see the anatomy of the OCT, it has a light source from where light goes into an interferometer, which splits the light, and one part of the light goes to a reference mirror and back, and the other part through scanning optics goes to the ocular tissue and then comes back. And then the reflected image from both these reference mirror as well as from the scanning optics and the eye is then passed back through a photodetector and a preamp and a band pass filter, etc., demodulator, AD converter, and then sent to a computer to analyze. Basically, what all these things do is they see the difference between the reference mirror image and the image which is coming from the tissue to kind of give you an imaging of the cornea. And basically, it's like doing an optical biopsy of the cornea. You are able to do biopsy of the internal structures without cutting anything. And it looks very similar to histopathology slides of optical biopsy actually. So the principle is low coherence tomography. Earlier we were using time domain OCTs in which the resolution was low, but now we have very high resolution OCTs which are available. Spectral domain and ultra high resolution OCTs are also available. OCT actually first came into application for non-ophthalmic purposes to image the arteries to see for plaque, atherosclerotic plaques. But now, of course, ophthalmology has become its biggest indication. So some machines can have standalone corneal OCTs, and in some machines, your retinal OCT, you put a specific lens on top to make it like an adapter lens to make it image the cornea very well. So various applications are available for the cornea for diagnosis, for planning therapeutic intervention, for follow-up, and also as a counseling tool. I use it also in the diagnosis of keratoconus as an adjunctive tool. The pachymetric map that you get from an OCT is actually very, very good. It's superior to what you get from slit scanning or a shine plug image. And of course, it's much superior to a spot pachymetry, which only gives you 1 point and doesn't give you a map-like data, which tells you like a pachymetric distribution of the whole area. So some of the OCTs also give pachymetric indices, just like you have topographic indices. They are not that important in my opinion, as it should be. What is probably more important is that newer topographers, the OCTs have something called an epithelial thickness map. So they are specifically able to measure the thickness of the epithelium alone. And by measuring the thickness pattern of the epithelium, you are actually able to pick up preclinical keratoconus. So what happens in early keratoconus is when the stroma is bulging up, it pushes the epithelium. And because of that push, in that area, the epithelium thins out and compensates for that bulge in the stroma so that the surface curvature remains normal. So that's why in the early stages of ectasia, surface topography may actually be normal. Although there is pathology has already started because the epithelium is compensating for the bulge of the stroma. And this compensation is what is picked up by the epithelial thickness maps of the OCT. So currently 2-3 OCTs in the market have this option. The most advanced, of course, is the one from Octoview. So this is one of my patients. You can see a classical topographic map of keratoconus on the left side. And the same patient, this is the right eye, and the same patient on the pachymetric map. You can see the pachymetry map also shows a focal thinning in the stroma, and the corresponding area of that thinning and the ectasia shows a focal thinning of the epithelium, which is shown in cooler colors, which is blue in this particular case. So green would be like a neutral color, red would be thickened epithelium, and blue would be a thinned out epithelium, which is very, very classic. So it's not the amount of thinning that is important, but the pattern of thinning. So you can see this. This is a 6 millimeter epithelial thickness map, 6 by 6. But now newer OCTs have 9 by 9 maps, which are quite large, almost to the limit. And because of that, you get a much wider bird's eye view of the epithelial pattern of the cornea. So what you will typically see in ectasia is you'll have a focal area of thinning surrounded by a ring of thickening, like a donut of thickening. And this is very, very typical of ectasia, and you'll see it almost every single time. So that's what you're seeing in this particular case. Now you can see that in the epithelial thickness map, which is on the right, you can see the blue zone, you can see the green zone of normal thickness of the cornea, and then you have seen the yellow zone, and it's actually a ring all around. You're just not seeing the whole thing because the map is only 6 millimeters. But if you were to see a larger map, you would see an entire ring. And that technique indicates that the corneal epithelium is constantly being made from the limbus, and it's moving centripetally. But if you have a bulged cornea like a hill, at the base of the hill, the cornea epithelium will start thickening and just stagnating over there. And even the tears start standing there. That's why you get a Fleischer ring at the base of a cone, right? Similarly, you get thickened epithelium at the base of your cone, which is what you see in this particular thickness map. So this is another patient. You see a little abnormality in the topographic map, not very hot colors. The pachymetry map is pretty normal actually, but if you see the epithelial thickness map, you can see a classic focal thinning surrounded by a ring donut of thickening, which is very typical of ectasia. So this made me suspicious. And of course, if you look at the other eye, it's a classical keratoconus. We have a classic topographic map of a keratoconus, hot color, like an island of thickening, and there is some thinning of the cornea, and epithelial thickness map again shows focal thinning followed by a lot of thickening. You can see even orange and red colors here. So this is a classic case where preclinical keratoconus has been picked up, or a very early keratoconus has been picked up very nicely by the epithelial thickness map. This is another case of ectasia. You can see on the left the topography, and right shows a focal thinning, very thinned out epithelium, and a nice ring of thickening around it, annular thickening. In addition, it also is useful in other clinical situations like hydrops. You don't know what's really going on behind this thick cornea, and OCT tells you where there is a break in the Descemet membrane through where the fluid has come in. So if you want to plan some sort of an intervention for the hydrops, you can actually visualize the posterior cornea to see whether putting a gas will help, or you need to do some other surgical procedure to kind of plan this eye. So any place where you cannot see through the cornea very well, OCT comes in very well, very useful to see the deeper layers of the cornea. So even in planning intervention for ectasias, to look for the area of the thinning, the location of how wide the thinning is, etc. The pachymetric map will help you, and then the OCT will tell you if there are any deep scars, etc., which will help you to plan the type of surgical intervention. Like if you want to do a deep lamellar keratoplasty kind of surgery, you cannot do a descemetic deep lamellar keratoplasty if you are thickening of the descemet or scars in the deep stroma involving the descemet membrane. So this is just one of the patients with advanced ectasia. You can see very focal thinning. You can see whether you can accommodate a needle in that area or not. These are patients with descemet membrane irregularities, so you cannot plan a big bubble DALC. In these cases, you will definitely get a rupture of the descemet membrane if you try to do that. So you have to do like a pre-descemetic DALC, leaving behind a little bit of stroma if you're planning a deep lamellar keratoplasty. You can also image interventions like cross-linking. This is before, inferior is before, and above you can see the hyperreflectivity in the anterior stroma. You can measure the depth of your demarcation line to see how deep your cross-linking effect has gone. This is a classic demarcation line which is seen about a month after cross-linking. And after 2 months, you can see it starts disappearing, but you start seeing other kind of deeper scars in the cornea because of the remodeling of the stroma. Another patient with their demarcation line. This is the OCT of a patient with TED. You can see a very thick cornea initially on the right, and after these checks, you can see within 2 weeks the cornea starts becoming thinner. This was a posterior keratoconus, which is very nicely seen, and you can see just the slit lamp also will show you the same thing. So it's like an optical section on the right with a slit lamp, and on the left with an OCT. And if you were to do an optical biopsy of the proper biopsy of the corneal button, also will show very similar, except it will be pink and blue. This is a OCT of a posterior polymorphous dystrophy. You can see very well the thickened band of endothelium over there, which is very classical of posterior polymorphous. And correspondingly, you can see a thickened stroma on the pachymetric map, almost 680 or 690 microns thickness, even though the cornea appears clear. This is a macular dystrophy, which shows these kind of irregularities of the stroma and diffuse hyperreflectivity. And if you were to see the pachymetric map, it shows the global thinning of the cornea, which is very classical of macular dystrophy. That's one of the ways to differentiate it from granular dystrophy, where you won't see thinning of the cornea. Of course, the intervening stroma is also hazy here. That's why you get this diffuse kind of a hyperreflectivity. One other area where OCT is very useful is ocular surface neoplasias, to see the depth of involvement of the lesion, as well as to differentiate it from other lesions which may simulate an OSS. And so you get this classical demarcation between normal and abnormal epithelium. And you can also see that the sub-epithelial layers are pretty normal in a normal cornea, whereas the epithelial, you see there's a significant thickening in that area. You can also see if there's any invasion of the deeper layers, whether the Bowman membrane or the stroma has got infiltrated. So OCT has come as a very useful tool in OSSM to kind of prognosticate and also in diagnosis. This is another area where it's very useful plan interventions involving laser like PTK. This is a patient of recurrent corneal erosion. You can see hyperreflexivity near the basal epithelium because there is abnormalities of the adherence of the semidesmosome. And if you were to plan a PTK, you don't really need to go very deep. You just need to do about 10-15 microns after removing the epithelium because the rest of the stroma is pretty normal. This is a patient of post LASIK. You can see the DLK in the inferior picture, which is hyperreflectivity in the interface. And suppose you are planning to plan an enhancement and you want to know how much is the thickness of the bed or thickness of the flap, OCT will really help you to measure exactly what is the thickness of the flap, how much stroma you have in the flap, how much is the epithelium, and how much you have in the bed to plan intervention, also to assess dimensions of the flap, etc. Of course, it's very useful in pre-LASIK screening because the epithelial thickness map, like I told you. This is another patient with peripheral sands of Sahara, grade 1 DLK, which is imaged very nicely in the OCT. Epithelial ingrowth or any very dense opacity will ask a shadowing. Just like in B-scan, you get a shadow with a foreign body. In OCT also, you can get shadowing and dense opacities like these. For enhancements, I told you it's useful to measure the flap thickness. It's also useful to measure the anterior chamber depth very accurately for planning of physic arrows. Also, if you want to measure the angle-to-angle diameter, you can use an OCT for that. So also after the surgery to see the walls of your phakic lens, useful. You can measure that very well with the OCT. Post-surgical interventions like deep lamellar keratoplasty to see if you have left any stroma, how is the interface, etc. If you have any, like this was a desmetic valve, you can see the bed is just desmetic membrane, and this was a pre-desmetic valve. You can see there's a little bit of residual stroma in the OCT very clearly demonstrated here. This is a patient who had desmetic membrane detachment, and this is after DALS, so like a double anterior chamber, which is imaged very nicely with the OCT. Sometimes you may not be able to see it on the slit map. After other surgical interventions like endothelial keratoplasty, you can see the cornea becoming compact, and the thickness of your lenticule also can be measured very well. This is a patient of epidemic keratoconjunctivitis, which we see very commonly with adenoviral keratoconjunctivitis. You can see the depth of your involvement, and it also helps you differentiate from other regions like microsporidia, which are involving the epithelium, not much of the subepithelial involvement in microsporidia. Also in microbial keratitis, if you have a lot of thinning, you can help to quantify the thinning to see if you need to do some sort of a tectonic procedure to plan. Of course, the infiltrate itself will show some reflectivity. So in the early stages, before it becomes an infiltrate, you have this cellularity. You can see it as hyperreflectivity like this. Like I told you earlier, you can also use it for meniscometry and also to quantify conjunctivochalesis, which is folds of conjunctiva which are prolapsing out, and you can see before and after so well it has been documented using an OCT. Even contact lens deposits can be imaged on an OCT as is shown in this particular slide. This is another very useful entity. You can actually calculate the true net corneal power. So especially in irregular corneas or post-LASIK corneas, just like you can do with Scheimpflug topography, you can also use an OCT to get a very accurate calculation of the net corneal power, which you can then feed into normal formulas using a conversion factor and get accurate IOL calculation, alpha calculation in all these irregular forms. Should I stop for a minute? Do we have time to do confocal and specular, or should we skip this?
I think Dr. Rushi will wait for that. We'll just take a break now, and Dr. Pandaman can ask a few questions.
Sure.
Where else you will use OCT in cornea? Anybody?
Ma'am, I think Sir has mentioned most of the indications, but ocular surface neoplasia.
Yes, ocular surface neoplasia is there, and of course, post-operatively, in which condition post-operatively it is important?
Ma'am, after a distance detachment has been reported to be
TM
Yes,
or
detachment.
C3F8.
yes, because there is a lot of corneal edema,
A
and
lot.
you are not able to see what is the status of the DM. In such cases, you can very well go for OCT. Then, in post keratoplasty patients also, you have to see the graft junction host also. Graft host junction also you can be very well visualized on the OCT.
Yes.
That overriding shifting of the grafts, that is very well visualized. You can very well see your surgery post-operatively.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Shilpa ma'am, any question from your side?
Not really. Dr. Rushi has practically included all the
Everything.
indications for, yeah. So it's like a preparation for long questions for these residents. Long
PG.
question on anterior segment to OCT.
Okay, I'm asking few general questions from the audience. What are the indication for rose Bengal staining?
Is the
Ma'am, you
question
can
for
also
Dr. Rishi or Dr. or PG
anyone.
students?
No, it's for the experts. No. It's for the experts and Dr. Rushi. What are the indication for rose Bengal?
So rose Bengal is a very, very useful vital dye. It will stain any sort of devitalized tissue, which could be from an ocular surface disease or even in ocular surface neoplasias or even some inflammatory conditions of the eye. So basically, it stains conjunctiva as well as cornea. So dry eye, OSSN, any condition which affects the health of the epithelium or even breaks up the glycocalyx of the epithelial microvilli, those will stain with rose Bengal. So essentially any ocular surface disease it is useful, but particularly it is useful in dry eye and OSSN to demarcate the extent of the lesion. It's very, very useful.
Okay, thank you so much. Another question is that many of us don't have access to the costly machine to analyze meibomian glands. On a slit lamp, how do you evaluate it? Meibomian gland evaluation on slit lamp.
So I think that was covered. Basically, you want to look at the meibomian gland orifices, look if they are properly open or if they are blocked or capped. So if you have capped orifices, that indicates that the health of the glands is not good and the type of secretion which is present inside is not healthy. Normal, and then you have to apply a little pressure at the lid margin to see the kind of fluid that is coming out. The normal meibomian secretion is like olive oil. It is transparent and clear. And unhealthy oil is present when the gland is infected with some sort of a bug, either a bacteria or a parasite like Demodex. And in such condition, you will see a cheesy or a ghee-like secretion, ghee type of secretion. If you're seeing very thick, pasty secretion, that is abnormal. And of course, if it is frankly white, toothpaste-like or yellowish, that doesn't leave any doubt in your mind. So you want to see the quality of the meibomian secretion as well. And basically, you need to then, if you have this kind of a secretion coming out, it indicates that there is some sort of a infection in these glands, and also this could indicate a blockage. And such patients will benefit from a hot fomentation or a lid massage, etc., or a liquid flow kind of treatment. But if you have an atrophic kind of a opening, it could indicate that the gland is actually died. So if the opening is not visible or it's very collapsed and nothing is really coming out on pressure, it could indicate that the gland is dead. So that's what you can do on the slit. Also, when you invert the trastral conjunctiva, you can actually see the meibomian glands similar to what you see on meibography. You see them as whitish streaks. So you can also see them on the slit lamp, but they are not as clear as what you see on a meibography.
Okay, another question is that there are so many variety of TS substitutes are available in the market now. Based on your examination on dry eye, can you suggest which drop to use in which condition?
So when you talk about the tear substitute, there are three main things that you should be looking at in the tear substitute. What is the active ingredient, which is CMC or polyethylene glycol or sodium hyaluronate, etc., etc. The second thing is the preservative, which in older drops was benzalkonium chloride, and nowadays we have disappearing preservatives like curite, etc., which are there. And the third main thing is the additive. So you have certain electrolytes, or you have certain things which help to maintain the osmolarity of the tear, or hypoosmolar agents, or you have tear stabilizing agents like lipids which may be added in, or stuff like that, which basically add value to the tear. So these are the value addition to the tear. So these are the three things that you should be looking at. In a garden variety evaporative dry eye, if it is mild dry eye, you can use any preserved tear substitute which is cheap. You can use something which has a back also, and any brand multi-dose vials are fine. But if you have an aqueous deficiency dry eye, authentic, like a keratoconjunctivitis sicca or Sjogren syndrome, in such cases, I would strongly suggest to use either a disappearing preservative or a preservative-free lubricant. Like you have these unit dose vials which are available, or nowadays you have these multi-dose vials which are available in specialized bottles called the Novelia bottles, and they have no preservatives. Preservatives, if you are going to be infilling a drop more than 4 times a day, the preservative can cause toxicity. So if you're going to use up to 4 times a day, even with a preservative, even that is okay. But more than 4 times a day, try to take a disappearing preservative, and even better to go for a preservative-free. And if you have, if possible, something which has additive, which will reduce the osmolarity of the tears, or which will help improve the health of the corneal epithelium. All these things will also be useful. In evaporative dry eye, you specifically want something that will stabilize the tear film. So you can add anything which has like HP Goa, which is present in some of the lubricants. It will give stability to the tear film and glycocalyx, or you have lipids in some of the tear films or lipid components, which will help to stabilize the surface of the tear. So these are the things that you want to select your lubricant on. And of course, cost comes into play depending on the patient's financial condition and the chronicity for which you need to use the medication. You can choose the drop.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr.
Other-
Rishi. It was
Thank you so
a
much.
great talk. Yeah, thank you. And I feel because of the time constraint, we cannot take the next topic. It was
Yeah, no
very well
problem.
explained. Yeah, we'll have it again for the PGs,
Sure.
because you speak so well and you explain so many basics of slit lamp examination, even OCT. Even I understood quite a lot from your talk today. Thank you very much for that. And I would also like to thank Dr. Ranjana madam and Dr. Shilpa madam. They are the expert teachers as well as examiners. And for all you PGs, this is what you need. And I would request all PGs who are watching this today, you can inform us, you can send messages to us, like what all topics you need from your exam point of view or from clinical point of view, like those tough topics. We have excellent faculty like Dr. Rishi. So we can request them again and again for you, because Pune Ophthalmological Society has decided that we will have this postgraduate program, education program. We call it PPE, POS Postgraduate Education Series, PPEs. So we are going to continue this, and that should benefit all the PGs all over India, not just from Pune. And so Dr. Rishi, I would definitely request you that you'll have to come once again for the remaining topics. And over to you, Dr. Sachin, now.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. On the behalf of Pune Ophthalmic Society, I wish to thank our speaker today, Dr. Rishi Swarup, for his excellent talk, a simplified explanation, and excellent coverage of all the topics. Also thank our expert today, Dr. Pandey ma'am and Dr. Shilpa madam, for giving their valuable time and inputs and special questions to be asked in exam. They are covered quite well. A special thanks to our panelist PGs, Dr. Richa, Dr. Ananya, Dr. Padma Priya, for joining us. Special thank to our POS President, Dr. Gitanjali ma'am, for coming up this beautiful idea of PG education program. Our Secretary, Dr. Mukesh, for executing this so well. Entire managing committee of POS, all members of POS, and more importantly, all of you for joining on a Sunday afternoon for this beautiful program. Also, thank to Centaur for supporting this academic activity. And thank you one and all for joining us today. Thank you so much. We look
Thank you,
forward on the
Ranjana
record.
madam, Shilpa madam, and
Thank
thank you, Dr.
you.
Rishi.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank
I'd
you.
like to
You all
thank
the best, all the PGs for your studies and exams.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rishi, for joining.
Thank you.